Hey guys, Eddie back with Couch Talk. Welcome back to the show. As always, guys, please hit like, please hit subscribe, turn your notifications on, follow me, and I promise I will earn your viewership. Um, what I wanted to do today was kind of circle back to one of the topics that I had done early in my channel. I say early; it was only about a month ago. But one of the topics that I did was on the argument of pro-life versus pro-choice, and I took a pro-life stance. That is I maintained that position. But it got a lot of dialogue, which, by the way, guys, is fantastic. One of the best things I think that we can do in society is to continue to have this dialogue, to continue to discuss, our society and how these things affect our lives. And I think that was terrific. I mean, the more information we all put out together, the more, the better it is for everyone. And what I wanted to do was I got a lot of kind of individual counterpoints, a lot of individual arguments for the pro-choice stance. And what I wanted to do was kind of like try to steelman those if I can, try to reinforce as well as I can, try to restate and understand, empathize with those arguments, but then of course give my response to each, because I think that in almost each one of those cases there is a valid counter argument again. So one of the first things that was addressed was kind of the way that I had chosen to define life, and I agreed with the gentleman who discussed it with me that perhaps my definition wasn't the most precise. And one of the things I did was I took a look at a lot of different definitions of life, and some of them are perhaps slightly better. Some of them are perhaps slightly worse. One of the things I noticed is that some of these definitions are simplified, for example, for the purposes of, education to children, or for the purposes of, just giving a very, I'm sure if you had a long biological explanation, it would be a lot more cohesive, a lot more nuanced. Like one of the definitions I saw, for example, was the definition that NASA gave for life. And, some of the things that it said are things like, life is able to live and, have cellular homeostasis independent of anything else. And the trouble with a lot of these definitions, like, for example, we started talking about a living creature that is independent. Well, I don't think anybody, any creature, is truly independent. I think we're all dependent on our environment, right? Like, I mean, I can't live without food, right? So we need to sort of expand some of these definitions. Funny, I usually talk about not expanding definitions to the point, that past where they were in the previous history. But in this case, I think this definition, has to be encompassing enough to, for example, at least fit a human being in, right? I don't feel like if a human doesn't fit within the confines of the definition of life, then, like, what are we doing, right? Another example is, like, I saw a definition that said, has the ability to reproduce. Well, in many of these cases, right, the creature may not have the ability to reproduce independently again, right? Like, for example, by that definition, a rabbit wouldn't be alive. Two rabbits would, a male and a female rabbit, right? Because only then would it actually be able to procreate. And then they would have to be rabbits of a certain age. Same thing with humans, right? Like, I think we can all agree that a 10-year-old girl is still alive, even though she cannot yet reproduce, right? So one of the good things about that challenge to the definition that I had used earlier is I've learned to become a little bit more nuanced in my language. So one of the things that I'd say now is the creature is ordered toward being able to reproduce, or ordered toward, being able to, breathe, being able to respond to stimuli, things of that nature, right? There were a lot of individual challenges, a lot of individual counter arguments, people that chose to define perhaps the embryo as living, but maybe not human, which is a weird one because I think we're pretty sure it's human DNA from the moment of conception. So I'm not sure why it wouldn't be human, but it's more of a challenge of personhood, not necessarily the challenge that it's actually human, but challenge that it's kind of like a self. And it's a very complex definition. Well, the first counter argument that I heard was that it's not alive yet, right? That basically a child isn't alive until it's born. I think this one is essentially scientifically disproven, and I continue to maintain that. Most of those definitions of life fit from the moment of conception, and many more of the definitions of life fit like 2 weeks in, so it would be kind of a silly thing to make that distinction. But I mean, I could see that being potentially a logically consistent argument if you were to say, okay, it's alive the moment it has brain cells. Complicated, but maybe, But here's what I would say. I ask people to think about, speaking of NASA, think about, let's say you're an astronaut and you are traveling to a new world and you're the first traveler to this world, first visitor from another planet, and you're an exobiologist, and you're looking around and you spot something that behaves exactly like a human embryo, right? Without, of course, it being inside another creature, because, of course, we've discussed that, location doesn't really change the relationship and independence of the functions of life, again, isn't. We'll discuss that in greater detail later. But you just spot the first unicelled version of the embryo, and then it divides and multiplies, and it keeps on dividing, and then it starts ordering itself and rearranging the cells to have heart cells, brain cells, liver. If you saw that on another planet, you'd be like, "Whoa, guys, this is." Guys, this is whoa, obviously. I think we all kind of instinctively know that anything that behaves like an embryo behaves is alive. I'm not sure that we would instinctively know that it's human until it starts to take form, but I'm pretty sure we know it's alive. And to be fair, largely the people I talk to, they largely don't challenge whether or not it's a living creature. And most biologists just sort of kind of assume that it's living. Most medical doctors assume it's a living human. The only challenge I get is whether or not it's actually a person yet, whether or not it's a self. And that goes to sentience, right? It goes to like consciousness. Now, in many of these situations, many of these counter-arguments, the counter-argument I will provide is an example of a already born individual who still has that same trait or is lacking that same trait that is being challenged. So, for example, if you were to say, a human being that does not live independently from the mother is not alive, well then, or is not a living human or doesn't count as a person, then I would give you the counterexample of somebody that uses a pacemaker or an iron lung. In both of those situations, that person is not able to live without those things independently, right? But I think it's clear that we wouldn't just go up to them and stab them because they're a pain in the butt. We might want to, depending on who it is, but we're not going to do that, right? That's where we respect the value of human life, even in a situation where that human needs help to live dependently upon another part of its environment. In the case that, let's say you challenge the fact that it doesn't have memory. Well, some science, this is a complicated one, right? Because some science kind of demonstrates that kids actually the babies have memory before they're born. And other science indicates that it may not happen until after they're born in a couple of months into life. I think obviously the argument that, we can kill a 1-month-old baby is a shaky ground to stand on, right? So that would be the counterexample of a already born human that may not have that trait. But again, we don't know for sure. So one of the things that I'd like to say is that I would never want to use as legislation anything that we can't definitely put on, like, this is where it happens, right? Like when people say, until it thinks, until it feels pain, for example, it's like, well, we can't really say exactly when it happens. We can kind of guess, somewhere in a 3-week, 4-week range, is when it starts to get those brain cells, and then maybe 5-6 weeks starts to, respond to some stimuli. But we can't know exactly when it's going to be different for every human, right? Just like all of us develop differently. The only way, and I continue to maintain this, the only place where you can 100% across the board guarantee that that this is a consistent place to point to where life begins is at conception. Some people say, viability, inside and outside the womb. But again, that kind of goes back to the argument about being able to live independently from the mother, right? And again, we talked about independent life versus dependent life. We're really never completely independent. Also, I mentioned even in the first video the difference between, someone who's born in the desert in the Sahara, 250 miles from the nearest town, and someone that's lives 5 minutes away from Johns Hopkins. I think one of them is going to have a better chance at survival at 4, 5, 6 months, and the other one is not going to have that same chance. So viability changes from location to location. Again, it's an inconsistent definition. We want some place where we can say, this is where it happens. This is where the magic is, right? A difficult one, a hardest one perhaps to define, is that concept of sentience, right? That concept of, is it a person yet? And the counter argument that it only becomes a person when it is sentient. And this is a really complex one because one of the problems is, again, we don't really know what that means. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we're running into as we do the artificial intelligence work that we do is to teach a robot sentience, and many are trying. We're trying to build essentially a neural network that mimics a human. I don't know why we're trying to do this, because I think it's a mistake, but we'll talk about that in another video. But we're trying to do that, and we're having a lot of trouble getting a robot to actually be sentient, right? We can have robots that we're certain will mimic sentience algorithmically, and maybe that's all it is. And if that's all it is, if it's just a biochemical algorithm, well, then I think it's pretty obvious that sentience begins from the moment that biochemistry begins, which is, with the moment of conception, fertilization. But if it's not, if it's something more, like if it's some kind of weird combination of, brain interpretation, mental stimuli response, and, self-awareness, and, the understanding of your relationship with regard to other things, other beings in particular, well, that's a really complicated situation. It doesn't happen in most children until they're, several years old, right? And arguably, humans, it's probably not even like a point at 1 or 2 that kids become sentient, or 3 months. It's probably a continuous spectrum where they just continue to develop again until they are fully sentient at 7 years old, 8 years old, 12 years old, 20. Who knows, right? It's a very difficult concept to try to pin down. And again, we need consistency when we're trying to describe whether or not this thing is to be afforded the same rights as other humans. We need to be consistent in our definition. Otherwise, why not kill 2-year-olds? Why not kill 7-year-olds? Why not kill 12-year-olds, right? At some point, we have to draw that line. We're choosing birth, but there's really no logical reason why we would choose birth. If you're to say, I don't believe the kid is alive until it is born. Well, science basically refutes that. Now, if you to try to make one of these more nuanced counter arguments is more complicated, but then it becomes less consistent, less easy to pin down. One of the things I hear is that, that men don't have a say. And this is one that it really kind of gets under my skin. It's one of the few arguments that I just absolutely hate and would respond very strongly to, very negatively to. And the reason for that is because you do not have to be the person that is most affected by a policy or legislation to discuss it. Philosophy is fair game to anybody. I can talk about bugs on Jupiter, to quote Joe Rogan. I don't know anything about bugs on Jupiter. I've never been to Jupiter. I don't even really know much about the planet. I've studied it a little bit. I don't know what kind of insects might live on Jupiter, if any, and I'm guessing none. But that doesn't mean that I can't opine, right? I, for example, am not a thief. I don't go around stealing things. But that doesn't mean that I can't talk about legislation that affects thieves, right? I also don't get stolen from very often, if ever. It does happen occasionally. It's usually through the use of scam artists or cons. But that, again, doesn't make me immune to being able to talk about it. Very dangerous to try to shut that, especially, and think about this in the back of your mind as you're thinking about, if you're trying to debate somebody or you're trying to have a conversation with them, and your idea is, let's shut down conversation from 75% of the opposition, then you're not actually trying to have a philosophical conversation. You're just trying to shut the opposition down and then just not have any challenges to your voice. You just want an echo chamber, right? Another thing I hear a lot is this right to abort, right? Women say, oh, they're taking my rights away. No one should be able to take away my right to abort children. And I'm looking at the Constitution and I'm like, all right, life, liberty, pursuit of property, right to abortion. Oh, it's not in there. There's no right to abortion. That's crazy. Now, I'm being facetious, right? Obviously, we could look at the individual rights and see which right it might fall under, right? So, for example, it's life. Probably not life, right? Because in most cases, the woman to abort the child is not fighting for her life. In the cases where she is, I've already stated that I would be 100% on board for a woman to protect her own life. And in doing so, if she has to do that to abort a child, to do that perfectly above board. And I don't really know any major pro-life argument that doesn't include that one. So let's talk about the next one, right? Liberty. Now, liberty is a complex and nebulous term that could very well include the effects that an abortion might have on somebody, right? So, for example, let's say you're a schoolgirl and you get pregnant at the age of 13. Well, quite literally, getting pregnant will affect your liberty certainly for 9 months if you have to carry it to term, and possibly much longer if you end up keeping the baby. Of course, you don't have to keep the baby. You could always just give it up for adoption. But in theory, it could end up harming your liberty, both socially, physically, and economically, right? Again, I know this is going to sound crass, and I don't mean it to sound that way, but we discussed in the first video the difference between cause and consequence, the difference between stimuli and response, right? So again, it's like if you were to go into McDonald's and pay for a cheeseburger and then eat it and then tell the clerk, oh no, I want my money back because you're restricting my liberty by removing you're putting me in economic duress by taking that money. And the guy's like, well, you already made your decision. You already bought the cheeseburger. You already ate the cheeseburger, right? Like we went through this process. You decided to go through the process. The consequence of your actions is to lose that money. Similarly, we need to make sure that there remains consequences to having sex. I don't think that removing consequences from action in our society leads to good things, right? It's basically like that in every other facet of society, right? We don't want to put ourselves in a situation where we can go steal from somebody and then not have to worry about the consequences, where we can go do whatever we want. You know, I can jump in somebody else's pool, break into their house, run amok, knock their TV down, and then just not have to deal with the consequences, right? We need to make sure as a culture that we are not just doing whatever we want. And the way that we do that is by making sure that we are accountable for our own actions. So when you choose to have sex, when you choose to not use contraception, that incorporates the choice to get pregnant. And now, not always, right? Contraception fails. That's not, I don't want to be like, an absolutist, right? I'm not a fundamentalist. Sometimes, you could go in with every attempt to not get pregnant, but you still had the choice to have sex, right? And in most cases, and I mentioned again, if you didn't make that choice, for example, if you were molested, you were raped, then again, I was on board with the termination of that child as it would be perhaps a further attack to your person. But even one of the things that I hear a lot is I'll hear people that argue for being pro-abortion or being pro-choice. They argue those extremes, the case where a mother is fighting for her life, the case where a mother is raped, and I'm like, those make up such a small fraction of abortions. Like 95% of abortions take place just for convenience. And I think 90% of them take place in the first trimester for that reason, right? Because they want to make sure that they do not receive the negative repercussions of their actions, and they want to do so as quickly as possible. Obviously, to carry a child to term and then give it up for adoption leaves them open to missing work, being persecuted perhaps, which is a terrible thing. We should never do that as a society. We should absolutely support mothers more. That is one of our chief failings. And one of the things I hear people say is that, well, what do you do? Do you do anything to help that single mother? And I'm like, absolutely. 100% I give to charity. 100% some of that charity goes to people in need, including single mothers, especially mothers that are expecting. You write the church that I donate to, they absolutely will help you out. 100% will. Is there enough for everyone? I don't know. I haven't done enough research to know all the numbers on that, but there's absolutely support out there. 100% there's support out there. I've heard the argument that to pass any legislation that would limit abortions is like imposing a religion. And in a sense, this is an accurate argument. In a sense, that's a valid point. Now, what I would say, the counter argument to that is I would say that we do that all the time, right? I think essentially American law is based around the Ten Commandments. It's based around the Christian moral code, in essence. There are a few situations where it's just a response to the societal constraints, like traffic law doesn't really have much to do with, of course we want to be safe, we want to respect the worth of human life. But, for the most part, it's based on that moral code. And so I don't think that it's a stretch to continue valuing human life as we do elsewhere in society. Now, one of the things I want to circle back to is when we talk about the rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of property, or the pursuit of happiness, whichever one you prefer. I prefer property, right? The big thing about those rights is you only have them until they affect someone else, right? Like I have the right to life. right? I have the right to liberty. I can walk around and do what I want, unless it hurts somebody else, unless it takes the life, liberty, or pursuit of happiness away from someone else. So, I have the right to do whatever I want with my body, unless I want to stab somebody with my body. Then it's not my right anymore, right? Same thing applies here. I know it seems different, it feels different, but it's still not different because it's still another human being, living human being inside the mother. So she may feel like she has that liberty, and she does, until it affects the life of another, the life of the child. And one of the things that I think is always thrown back at pro-lifers is that it's like, well, you don't care about the mother. You know, it's like, no, nothing could be further from the truth. I care about both of those lives, not just the one, right? Let's look at this from one more perspective if we can. And I know it's been a long video. Thank you so much for bearing with me. Even if we think of this living embryo, this human being, as not alive yet, even if we don't admit that it's alive, even if we say it's not living till the moment it's born, it is still a potential life. Even if your goal is to think that it's just a potential life, it would still have incredible worth. And I don't mean to say that people do abortions flippantly, although I have seen in recent times this kind of like celebratory, oh, I'll donate my next abortion to you garbage. And I think it's less a celebration and probably more a fighting back against persecution. But even so, I don't think women just kind of just, willy-nilly just have abortions all day long. I think it's always kind of a difficult decision. Even for those who have had them many times and just sort of do it routinely, I think it's always going to be a complicated situation. So I want everyone to respect that, right? To appreciate that it's not an easy decision. But that having been said, many decisions in life are not easy ones. And almost always, if your choice is between the promotion of life, even if it's not directly affecting a life yet, but it's something that might lead to further life, or convenience, this one is almost always going to have more moral justice behind it, right? Like if your choice is between the promotion of life, eventual life, or, financial hardship, even the potential life is more important. So just think about these things as you go back, and I'd love for someone to come back and have another back and forth, have more dialogue. I'd even love to debate this topic with somebody live on my show. I'd love anybody who wants to have this conversation with me. I would love it. So please tell me what you guys think. Let me know what you think. Put your comments below. We'll talk about it next time on Couch Talk.